Hello and welcome. My name is Alana Weiss, and today it is my pleasure to welcome Susan Cain to the Leading at Google series. Today we'll hear about her new book, Quiet, The Power of Introverts in a World That Can't Stop Talking. Next week you'll see it's number 4 on the New York Times bestseller list, and Susan will soon be giving a presentation at TED 2012. Before Susan became a writer, she practiced corporate law for 7 years, representing clients like JP Morgan and General Electric. She then worked as a negotiations consultant, training all kinds of people, from hedge fund managers to TV producers to college students negotiating their first salary. She went to Princeton University and Harvard Law School. Reflecting on these experiences, Susan writes, "From all this, you might guess that I'm a hardcore, wonderfully self-confident, pound the table kind of person, when in fact, I'm just the opposite." So today, in a room full of introverts and their champions, Susan will share her research and firsthand knowledge about the power of introverts. Thank you, and help me in welcoming Susan.
Hi, everyone. Well, I have come to believe from researching and writing this book for about 7 years now, started back in 2005. I've come to believe that introversion and extroversion are as profound a part of who we are, as core to our identities as our gender, and that therefore it's very important to understand where we truly fall on the introvert-extrovert spectrum. And when I say this, I'm not talking about where we appear to fall or who we appear to be, because most of us in this extroverted culture of ours act much more extroverted than we really are. So what I'm asking is who you are deep down. If you could spend your time exactly as you pleased, your work days, your weekends, who would you be? Would you be more of an introvert or would you be more of an extrovert? And this is a really important question, so I want us to get to the answer, get to the bottom of it before we move forward with the talk. And so what I'm going to ask you to do is to break up into groups of 6 quickly and share with your group a private and personal memory from your childhood that you think illustrates who you really are. And then we're going to take the most private and personal and profound of these memories and share them with the entire audience. And yes, that's right, I'm just kidding. And if there are any consultants in the audience, please don't do this to people in future talks. Introverts hate this kind of stuff. So let me just, though, get a show of hands. How many of you were thinking when you still thought that I might be serious, like, how can I get out of here right now without insulting the speaker? Yeah. And how many of you would describe yourself as introverts? Wow. Oh my gosh. Could it be 100%? No. Any extroverts in the room? Okay, maybe. I would say we have about 5 extroverts, so that's good because you can tell us your perspective. So, of course, also the important thing is not only to identify who we are, but why are we the way we are? What is it that makes an introvert an introvert or an extrovert an extrovert? And the truth is there are as many answers to this question as there are personality psychologists. But boiling it down, what really distinguishes us is that introverts prefer environments that are lower stimulation environments. So I'm talking now about social stimulation, but and so by that I mean you'd rather maybe have a glass of wine with a close friend as opposed to go to a thumping party full of strangers. But I'm not talking only about social stimulation. This also plays out in things like how much noise you like to have on in the background, how bright the lights are, how bright you like your lights to be. Even something as crazy as if I place a drop of lemon juice on your tongues, if I could do that right now, we would find that the introverts in the room would salivate more in response to the lemon juice than our 5 extroverts would, because introverts respond more to stimulation and therefore prefer lower amounts of it. And this is so important to understand because what it tells us is that if we want to optimize our lives and to be operating at our fullest powers and with our fullest amount of energy, we really need to put ourselves in environments that have the proper amount of stimulation for us. And there's one interesting experiment by the psychologist Russell Gogh that has even found that if you give introverts and extroverts math problems to solve with different levels of background noise, the introverts will do better when the background noise is lower, and the extroverts will solve the problems better when the background noise is higher. So we all have our different sweet spots, and then, of course, the question becomes, most of life is kind of a one-size-fits-all environment. Our schools, our workplaces are like this. So how do you design things? How can we think about ways to tailor the amount of stimulation for individual preferences? And the fuel that led me to write this book, to spend the last 7 years doing it, is that I have been distressed to see that our world is primarily set up in a way that I believe maximizes the energies of extroverts while not those of introverts. I think the bias in our culture against introversion, it is so deep and it's so profound, and we internalize it from such an early age, we don't even realize that we're doing it. But from the minute that you're introduced to a preschool classroom when you were a young child, you're immediately in an environment where you're expected to be happy in a group. And teachers have been found all the way through at every age level of the educational system. The vast majority of teachers believe, thank you, oh, much better. The vast majority of teachers believe that the ideal student is an extrovert, even though, by the way, introverted kids get better grades. And same thing is true at the workplace, in our workplaces. And you can tell me what your experiences are at Google. I would love to hear about this when we get to the Q&A later. But in general, in the workplace, we now live in an environment that, it's increasingly open plan offices where people don't have very much privacy. They're working in groups for a lot of the time. And studies tell us that introverts are routinely passed over for leadership positions, even though research by Adam Grant from the Wharton School, recent groundbreaking research, has found that introverted leaders often deliver better outcomes than extroverts do. And I say all this, when I say this, it is not to take anything away from extroverts. I think extroversion is a really enormously appealing personality style. It's just to say that this tendency, this kind of chauvinism that we have, this two-tier structure of how we view personality, leads to a colossal waste of talent and of energy and of happiness. And we need to be adopting much more of a yin and yang approach of balance between the two styles. And I want to talk about how this plays out in our lives, and I want to show you why it is so important that we get to this place of yin and yang, and why we will all be the better for it. Introverts for sure, but all of us. And to do this, I'm going to start in an unlikely place. I'm going to take you on a very quick tour of the animal kingdom, starting with a colony of fruit flies. So it turns out that there are introverts and extroverts in almost every single species of the animal kingdom. I mean, who knew this? But I found this out when I was doing my research. Many species have introverts and extroverts. So down to the level of fruit flies, there are what biologists call sitter fruit flies, who kind of sit still and kind of hop up and down in place. And then there are rover fruit flies, who explore the outer margins of fruit fly society. And the reason that they do this, the reason that many species are structured this way is because the two types have very different kinds of survival strategies. And so now I'm going to move a little bit up the animal kingdom, and I'm going to take you to the world of pumpkin seed fish. An evolutionary biologist named David Sloan Wilson did a really fascinating experiment with a pond full of these fish, where he came to the pond and he dropped this gigantic trap right into the middle of the pond. An event which he says from the fish's perspective must have seemed like a spaceship landing right in the middle of their backyard. And the fish responded really differently to this foreign presence. Some of the fish, the introvert fish, responded by saying, "I'm not getting anywhere near that thing." And they hovered on the sidelines of the pond. And as a result, they made it completely impossible for David Sloan Wilson to catch them in his trap. So, had that trap been a real predator, those fish, the introverted fish, would have been the ones that survived. The extroverted fish immediately had to investigate, what this trap was, and they went swimming right up to it, with nothing standing in their way. And of course, they were immediately trapped. Had it been a real predator, they would have been zonked. But it's not so simple, because then Sloan Wilson comes back a few days later with a fishing net, and he manages to scoop up the introverted fish who had eluded him the first time around, and he brings them back to his lab. And what he finds in this environment is that the extroverted fish do much better, because this is an alien world. It's a world of unfamiliarity. And extroverts tend to be more comfortable very quickly in unfamiliar environments. And so in this case, the extroverted fish started eating more quickly and going about their business more quickly, while the introverted fish were kind of hanging back and not faring well. So this is all kind of a parable to tell us that there really are different kinds of strategies for success and strategies for the survival and thriving of our species. And so now I'm going to come back to human beings finally. And I want first to talk to you about children, about human children. Let me ask you, how many people in the audience here have kids? Okay, so probably about 2/3 of you. But even for those of you who don't have children, the reason that what I'm going to tell you is important is that human children, they haven't yet absorbed the social norms of our society, and so therefore they act the way they really are meant to act, the way they truly are. And so if we look at the behavior of children, we learn a lot about ourselves. So, of you parents, how many of you have ever been to a kind of mommy and me class or daddy and me class? Okay, not many of you. So let me explain what this is, because it's going to be relevant. This is basically a class where a parent or a babysitter takes a young child, usually a baby or a 2-year-old, maybe a 3-year-old, and you all sit around in a circle. I'm going to show you what it looks like. Yeah, it looks like this. You all sit around in a circle and you sing songs and you play musical instruments and like that. Now what you will find in these classes is that some of the children will behave like the sitter fish, meaning they will stay closely by their parents' sides, they'll sit in their parents' laps, they won't really participate, and they will look either scared or just reserved. And then others of the children, like that little baby in the red jumpsuit who's right in the middle of the room, he's a rover child. And so he doesn't know where his mom is, it's all good with him, he's perfectly comfortable. Now, the thing is that the parents of the sitter children in this kind of a situation tend to feel pretty worried about their offspring. They feel like, wow, my child's not getting much out of this class, and maybe this is going to be the story of his or her life. Maybe he or she will always have trouble participating and won't get the fruits of what life has to offer. And this is a really understandable worry, but I want to broaden the picture for you of what's really happening with a child who behaves this way. That child is doing what psychologists call paying alert attention to things. So it may appear as if the child is sitting inertly and passively and not taking anything in, but that's not what's happening. They're learning by observing, and they're observing in a very intent way. And so very often with these children, I see it again and again, it may take them minutes or days or weeks or months to actually plunge into the situation at hand. But when they do, they already know the social rules. They already know the subtle nuances of what's going on because they have been paying attention all that time. And this form of paying attention to things, of noticing things that are scary, but noticing things in general at a subtle level, this carries through with these children all the way into adulthood. It becomes a kind of way of dealing with the world and a way of processing information. So, for example, if you give these children, when they're a little bit older, this kind of a puzzle to solve, where you have two pictures that seem to be very similar, and you ask them to figure out what the subtle differences are between them, these kinds of children will spend much more time than other children will comparing the two. In the lab, you can actually see their eyes darting back and forth more times than those of bolder children, and they more often get the right answers. And this kind of thing continues as these kids grow up. So you give them puzzles to solve, adult-sized puzzles. They take more time to do it. They get better grades in school. They get they're more likely to get Phi Beta Kappa keys. And then the other thing, and I'm sorry about this, extroverts, but introverts have actually been found to know more about many subjects. In one study of college freshmen, they tested the students of their knowledge of, 21 different subjects. It was like everything from art to astronomy to physics to statistics. And they found that the introverts knew more about all of these subjects. And what's relevant about this is that the introverts are not smarter. As far as IQ goes, the two groups, introverts and extroverts, totally similar IQ. So instead, what's happening here, the advantage that introverts have in these kinds of intellectual problem-solving puzzles is the very behavioral style for which introverts are often criticized. The very behavioral style that has you sitting still more, reflecting more, being more reserved, being more, just slow to process stuff. That is the flip side of the behavioral style that helps you in problem solving. Now, another way in which these kinds of children grow up to play really important roles in our culture is introverts and extroverts have very different attitudes to risk-taking, profoundly different attitudes. Extroverts are much more likely, when they see something that they want, to go for it. And this actually goes down to the level of neurochemistry. Extroverts have been found to have more active reward networks in their brain, so that if they see something that they want, or if they're contemplating a promotion, or whatever it is, literally their reward networks become more activated. And they get excited, and this is accompanied by all kinds of joyful and fizzy emotions. And it's actually these emotions, I think, that make extroverts such delightful company. They're kind of like champagne bubble emotions that come with the contemplation of a reward. And this can be a really great thing because it helps us to seize the day when we have these kinds of feelings. But the downside to this way of being is that when you're that focused on a reward, you don't see the warning signals that are also coming at you saying, maybe you should stop. Maybe there's a problem here. I mean, you literally don't see them as much. And introverts are much less likely to fall prey to that dynamic. I mean, they sometimes do. This stuff is not black and white. But they're less likely to fall prey to it. And so this is not to say that introverts don't also take risks, because they do. But they tend to be more slow and more circumspect about it. One study of a group of traders at a London investment bank found that the introverts were the most successful traders, probably because of this way of processing information. And another example of this would be somebody like a Warren Buffett, who is a self-described introvert, and is famous for sitting out on market bubbles that other people fall prey to, because he is the type of person, and he's actually said that the key to investing for him is not his knowledge but his temperament. So he pays attention to warning signals, and he sees them when they're coming. Okay. There are actually so many advantages that I want to talk to you about, but I'm going to run out of time, so I'm just going to tell you about one more for now, and we can talk more in the Q&A as well. I want to talk to you about creativity. So, two important studies, one by the psychologist Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi and another by Gregory Feist, have found that the most spectacularly creative people in a number of fields have tended to be introverts. And they're not just any introverts. These are introverts who have extroverted sides to them as well. They're people who can go out and they can exchange ideas and they can advance ideas and so on. But they're also people who are comfortable with solitude. And that is the key component, because solitude turns out to be a real catalyst to creativity. Not the be-all and end-all. It's a necessary but not sufficient condition, but it is necessary. And the reason for this is, it turns out, we're such social creatures, all of us, introverts included, we're such social creatures that we can't literally be around a group of people without instinctively mimicking the opinions of the people in the group. So even something as seemingly primal and personal and visceral as who you're attracted to, you will actually, if you're in a group of people who have declared so-and-so to be attractive, you will start finding so-and-so more attractive than you otherwise would have. And this is just a kind of fundamental tenet of human nature. And so if you want to go and find out what you really think about things, you almost can't do it without secluding yourself to some degree. But I want to be really clear about what I'm saying here and what I'm not saying. So when I say this, I'm not trying to argue that man is an island after all, to contradict John Donne. We're human beings, we love and we need each other. And I'm also not trying to say that we should be abolishing group work and abolishing teamwork. I think it's clear that we need that part of the creative puzzle as well. And that this is probably increasingly true every day, because as the problems that we face grow more complex, we're going to need more and more and more than we've ever done before to really stand on each other's shoulders. But what I am saying is that there are two kind of contradictory drives in human nature. And one of these drives is the drive that makes us come together. It's the drive that makes us love each other and need each other and trust each other. And then another of these drives is the drive for solitude and for autonomy and for independence. Excuse me. And introverts have that latter drive particularly strongly, but this is a drive that we all share. And so if we're going to, we need to figure out ways of harnessing both of these drives as productively as we can. And so I'm just going to call for 3 different kind of takeaways for us to think about. And I'm talking now at the kind of big picture level. And then at the Q&A, you can ask me questions that are more specific about your lives, your work lives, or your personal lives, or whatever. So the first takeaway I'd like to share with you is just to give yourself more time for quiet, more time for solitude, more time to just get away, to feel truly entitled to it, instead of feeling like it's something that you need to feel guilty about. The second one is to think really differently about the next generation of introverted children, because the same children who have been sitting on their parents' laps when they're 2 or 3 years old, and then grow into teenagers who develop solitary interests that they love to pursue, whether it's for spider taxonomy or for 19th century art or whatever it happens to be. These children often are the great artists and writers and thinkers of tomorrow, or they're just really fantastic human beings. And so we need to stop treating them as if there's something wrong with them, and instead appreciate and take delight in what is right about them. And then the final thing that I would say to you is for all of you to really think hard about what is the key to your own power. I'm going to come back now to the question that I asked you at the beginning when I threatened to break you up into groups to think about your powers. But we all know from myths and from fairy tales that there are many kinds of different powers that are on offer in this world. And some of us are given lightsabers, like Luke Skywalker, and we get to swashbuckle our way through the galaxies. And some people are given wizards' educations. But then there are some people where the power that is given to them is a key to a secret garden that is full of inner riches. And the trick to living well is to use the power that has been granted to you. Instead of trying to make do with all the different powers that are on offer, what is the power that has been given to you? And so that is what I want to say to you in closing. May you all use your powers well and brilliantly. Thank you very much.
Questions, of course.
Okay, I know there are questions. So you can ask me anything, any topic. It's all good.
And I'll kick it
You're
off
gonna
by
start.
reading
Okay.
a question that came from Lynn, who's a Googler based in Chicago.
Okay.
And she wanted to know what you thought of the cover of Time magazine. She writes, "As soon as I saw the cover, I immediately became alarmed by how inaccurate Time could have been with its choice. The cover says, 'The Power of Shyness.' This is ironic since Susan Cain, whose book this Time article was based on, wrote an article titled 'Don't Call Introverted Children Shy,' published by Time Online at the same time. I believe this cover was widely read, and it is a respectable magazine. And she's concerned about this doing disservice to children by reinforcing a misconception."
Yeah, so thank you. That's an important question. Time magazine did have this cover story about a week or two ago that was based on the research from my book, and they called it "The Power of Shyness." And it's true. Shyness has nothing, well, that's not true. Shyness is very different from introversion. So what shyness is it's the fear of social judgment. It's the fear of being socially humiliated. Whereas introversion is just what I was talking about before, the preference for lower stimulation environments. And in practice, these two do overlap to some degree. So there are some people who are both shy and introverted. But psychologists debate to what degree they overlap. And so it definitely muddies the waters to act as if they're synonymous. But it's also a tricky thing, because at the same time that I say all this, there's sometimes a tendency nowadays, more and more people are talking about the value of introversion. And in doing this, I think there's sometimes a tendency to demonize shyness. And I don't want to do that either, because really shyness itself doesn't have that much to recommend it. It's a painful emotion. But the underlying temperament, the careful and sensitive temperament that tends to produce people who are either shy or introverted, that temperament has a lot of value to it. And these things all get kind of thrown together into one soup.
Hi,
Yes,
thank you for
hi.
your talk.
Sure.
One of the things that I'm struggling with, or at least listening to all of this, is that I always struggle to identify myself as whether extroverted or introverted.
Yeah.
And I've taken the Myers-Briggs 5 times, 6 times, numerous times, and I've and extroverts will tell me, oh, you're definitely introverted, and then introverts will tell me, oh, you're definitely extroverted.
Right.
And then
right.
even in your talk, like there are certain elements that you'll tell about that, like when I was a child, like I know I was that way.
Yeah.
But then there's other things that are like, oh no, I'm definitely introverted. So
Yeah.
And then you have these key takeaways where it's like I got to find my inner self, or like whatever gift has been given to me.
Right.
Well, it's very unclear to like what I'm supposed to be emphasizing, and no one's ever been able to tell me otherwise. So I'm interested to hear. I mean, am I like a mutant case, or like is it? Because I know it's a gradient, and I know
Yeah.
I know there's a lot of ambiguity around it, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, absolutely. There's actually a word for people like you. You're not a mutant. You're an ambivert. And that is the word for people who fall, kind of right in the middle of the extrovert spectrum. And I often think that people who are ambiverts have the best of both worlds, because, I think each of these personality styles has real gifts, and people like you can, I think, choose more easily which style you want to adapt at any given moment. But I will say, too, even for people who really feel like you're on one side of the spectrum or the other, we're still gloriously mishmashed creatures, all of us. So we all have a little bit of the other side in us. It's kind of like if I were standing up here trying to give a talk on what maleness is and what femaleness is. I could get it mostly right, but I wouldn't be able to get it right for any one human being. And I wouldn't be able to get it right even for the group in general, because it's a little bit too complex. And yet it's useful to talk about these categories because it does illuminate something. So I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, thank you.
Hi.
Hello. So I've read a little bit about just kind of different temperaments, like the Please Understand Me books, like Kearsley, I think it is, I'm not sure. But I'm wondering how your definition of introversion and extroversion relates to these other aspects of temperament, like introspective and things like that. Like how do these, how do they interact with each other?
Yeah, it's all very complicated what this stuff is exactly. But I would say the definition that I'm using, like in this talk, it's pretty similar to what you would find in those books. And another way of looking at it is to ask yourself the kind of famous question you've probably most of you heard. How do I feel after I've been out and about in company? Do I feel energized and like I want more of it? Or do I feel, I'm really depleted, I've got to go home and just take a break? And the people in the latter category tend to be more on the introverted side. And useful to know it, because then you can build in the breaks you need, which is something I have been doing on my book tour.
Thanks. I guess I was just
Sure.
asking because it seems like a lot of the qualities of introverts that you described are sort of these introspective qualities, sort of observing or taking in the world around them.
Right. And I'm sorry, and your question about that is? Okay. Yeah, that, I would say that is very much part of the way I'm defining introversion. Yes. Hi.
It's somewhat related to the last question. So you have your definition about seeking lower stimulation environments, and which most of the other qualities of introversion fall out of. But another difference, I believe, is extroverts talk all the time, and introverts wait until they have something to say.
Yeah,
And that
yeah,
doesn't
absolutely.
really seem to follow from the previous definition. How is that, does that fall out of it?
Well, you mean, what does that have to do with stimulation?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, it really actually, if you think about it, talking and interacting is kind of the highest form of stimulation that there is. If you think about a simple conversation with your best friend, there's an enormous amount of stuff going on with it. You're reading body language, you're reading facial expressions, you're thinking about what you want to say, you're reacting to what they said. And so this is something that extroverts tend to plunge into with a little more ease.
Right, but they will keep talking with no response at all.
And
So it's not working. They're not getting stimulation from that. So it's...
oh, well, I don't know if I would say that. I mean, well, first of all, I don't know that all extroverts do that. But
Right.
to the extent that that's happening, the act of talking itself is a form of
All right.
real activity and of stimulation.
Okay.
Yeah. Hi.
Hi, Susan. Thank you for coming.
You're welcome.
So I'm pretty junior in my career, and I feel like many times I heard from career advices is that you should build your network. You should,
Yeah.
you should meet a lot of people. You should know a lot of people.
Yeah.
I feel like obviously extroverts have the leg up on introverts on this. So what are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, I think that the key to these kinds of exhortations is to find ways to do it that really are natural to you. And that sounds that sounds sort of fluffy, but it actually really can be done. So, for example, if you're going to a networking event, I always approach any networking event as a series of one-on-one conversations. And not only that, I consider it to be a success if I have made one honest-to-God, new, authentic relationship with one person whose company I sincerely enjoyed and look forward to staying in touch with. Because, honestly, how many people really can you stay in touch with in a real way after any given event? And if you use that test and you go to enough events, you will find pretty soon that you've got a Rolodex of people where you really want to help them and they really want to help you. So that's just one example, but I think there are ways to reframe almost all of the things that we need to do in the workplace in ways that suit our natural strengths. And then I would say, in addition to that sometimes you really do have to kind of go out of, push yourself outside of your natural temperament. And extroverts need to do this too. An extrovert might need to sit down and work on a memo for 5 hours when they might prefer to be chatting with colleagues in the hallway. So I think it's natural and good and healthy to be able to stretch ourselves to some extent, but just to make sure that we're not living in that place that's not really who we are most of the time. Sure. Hi.
Hi. Unlike a lot of the people here, I'm an extrovert. I'm married to an introvert.
Yeah.
And I'm also interested. So I'm interested in learning how to better work as an extrovert, deal with introverts,
Right.
and also I'd welcome any advice of what extroverts can learn from some of the advantages that introverts have that may not come as natural to us, but that we may want to work on.
Right. Would you like me to speak first about the marital? Yeah. So this is actually a pretty common question because, I don't know, the studies say that it's half of marriages that are introvert, extrovert, and that the other half, people are married to those of a like type. But I can tell you in my anecdotal experience, it seems like most couplings that I've seen are yin and yang couplings, where it's one introvert and one extrovert. And I think this is because there really is a natural and mutual attraction between the two types. And this has been found, by the way, in the workplace too, that teams that are composed of a mix of introverts and extroverts, that these teams actually, they're more effective because people are happier in that kind of a setting. But having said that, there are certain conflicts that arise. And I can tell you about 2 or 3 of the main ones that come up. So one of them is the question of how much to socialize. It might be that your partner wants to stay home all the time, and you want to be going out all the time. And so the key is to really, have a sense of understanding where each person's coming from. And I always say pre-negotiate these things so that you don't have to negotiate it every single Friday and Saturday night. Just agree in advance. Okay, we're going out one night every weekend. We're snuggling on the sofa. The other night, that's it. We don't have to talk about it anymore. Another thing that comes up that's relevant to both marriages and workplace situations with the two types is they actually have really different approaches to solving conflicts. So in general, there are some exceptions to this, but in general, introverts prefer a much more mild-mannered approach to conflict and might prefer to avoid it altogether. And extroverts tend to approach conflict in a more confrontive style, it's called. So I don't know if you've seen this in your situation, but that can lead to real misunderstandings because it can make the introverted person in the relationship feel kind of aggressed against if their partner or their colleague brings up an issue too directly. But the extrovert can feel lonely and abandoned if the introvert doesn't want to address an issue. Like the extrovert might feel like, they don't really care that much, or they're not that engaged with me, or else they would take the trouble to just hammer this thing out. So with all this stuff, really understanding where it's coming from can go a long way.
And if you have any comments for extroverts trying to learn from introverts.
Oh, yes. So a big one that I would say is to learn from introverts' tendency to think carefully about things. I was talking before about the tendency of extroverts to sometimes get so carried away with positive emotions and with wanting to go after a goal that you might not take the time to slow down, and see what's really happening. And in fact, if you do slow down, if you put in place certain mechanisms that will say stop, before you act, you will be able to see the warning signals that get in your way. It's the moving and the action that prevents you from actually seeing those warning signals. And then another thing I would say extroverts can learn from introverts is just to kind of sit down and be still and see what you can get from solitude and from just thinking and being and not moving all the time.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Hi.
Hi.
I keep thinking about your fruit flies that stay in one spot. Introverts stay in one spot, and then you have the extrovert fruit flies that kind of roam the world.
Yeah.
And so extroverts are kind of more roamers, and introverts kind of stay in the same place, or at least are more familiar in the same area. What does that say about, or like, what studies have been done about extroverts and introverts in relationships as far as like faithfulness or their, like whether they roam?
Aha. Well, yeah. Actually, extroverts have been found to be a little less faithful. It kind of goes into the overall profile of risk-taking that I was talking about before. They've actually been found to more often get into car accidents, to place larger financial bets, and to be somewhat less faithful in relationships. I'm sorry, but true. But that doesn't mean it's always true. These are just,
I'm only partially an extrovert, by the way.
Some of these things have small effects, but there are differences between the two groups.
Okay, thanks.
Sure.
I just wanted to say you had a pretty compelling talk to get me up to a microphone. It only happens like once or twice a year.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for being here.
Yeah, so I just really appreciate your book. And also I wanted to ask you about how introverts can get more visibility at work. Because on my team there are people who are shameless self-promoters who are always saying, look, I launched this thing. Look what I've done.
Yeah.
And I'm just like, I could never do that. I kind of look at them with admiration and a little bit of irritation because it's something I can't quite do myself. So
Right. I mean, can you figure out what is the what's the essence of what's keeping you from doing it? Is it that you don't really approve of it, or that you want to but you can't?
It just seems to, I don't know. Just self-promotion is really difficult for me. It's being very verbal about what you've done well. I guess it's kind of just saying that you've done a better job than other people, maybe, or I don't know.
Right. I mean, so that's one. I don't know if you guys all heard that, but that's one thing right there. If you view self-promotion as being an announcement of superiority over your peers, that could be pretty inhibiting. So that's one thing I would just suggest reframing. It's not really that. It's more just talking about what you personally have done, and don't think about it in relative terms. But what I would also say with all these things is to try to find ways of doing it that are comfortable for you, because if you try to ape somebody else, it's never going to happen. You might push yourself to do it once or twice, but you won't keep doing it. So might it work for you to to ask your boss, for example, for a meeting one-on-one where you just talk about your career and you kind of go over the things that you think you've been doing well and where you might want to be in the future, and maybe come to that meeting with a list, a memo that you've prepared in advance that lists the ways you've contributed. Like, I wonder if something like that would be more comfortable for you.
Very appealing.
Does it?
Yeah, maybe I'll think about doing that. Thank you.
You're welcome. Hello again.
So, do extroverts have more fun?
Oh, yeah. Well, so this is something I talk about this a lot on my blog. I have a blog. It's called thepowerofintroverts.com. And I talk about this because it comes up in the research a lot, the idea that extroverts might be happier than introverts, because it does seem that in general, extroverts have more of the very exuberant, very fizzy emotions that I was talking about that kind of accompany the pursuit of reward. But being a pretty happy introvert myself, I'm always motivated to think that must not be the full picture. So yeah, what I think is that there are a lot of different ways of having fun, and that many of the ways that introverts tend to have fun, they're not necessarily defined that way, and they're accompanied by a different constellation of emotions from the ones that we normally associate with fun. So it's not like jump for joy, huge grin on your face. It's something else. It's something quieter. And I've even started to explore this state that I call the happiness of melancholy, which is, why is it that things like, like minor key music. I love minor key music. It always makes me happy to listen to it. Why? Why does it make me happy? Why does the evanescence of a cherry blossom make us so happy when we know it's going to wither and disappear, a week from the day that we're viewing it? Why does that make us happy? That it's like the fact of its imminent disappearance is somehow elevating. And I think, I'm trying to figure out what it is. I think it has something to do with these kinds of states make us acutely aware of the fragile beauty of life and of love, and that's a form of happiness in and of itself that is not necessarily captured in the view of fun and of happiness that we tend to think of in our culture. So that may be a more philosophical answer than what you were hoping for, but those are my thoughts for today. Yes?
I work on a team where I'm the introvert who is supposed to lead, and I have a super extroverted member, and very strong team. But how do I? If I take a long time to talk, as you can see, I'm doing right now, and I have a colleague who can fill that space very easily. Right. Are there strategies for me to honor that person's voice yet still? Be part of the conversation.
But still be part of the conversation. Yeah. I mean, are you at all comfortable ever interrupting, or does interrupting feel to you like you're breaking a sacred trust? Because I think that is something a lot of people feel. Like I think they don't.
I think it's challenging. Yeah.
Yeah. So one thing would be to understand that to interrupt is actually not a terrible violation, especially if the other person is talking a lot. But. And it might be helpful for you to interrupt using your hands, like to say, oh, that's a great point. What about this? And kind of signal that you're now, physically, that you're now taking the space. Trying to think of other ideas for you. Another thing, do you have the kind of relationship where you can actually talk about this, you and your colleague?
That sounds like a good idea.
More comfortable?
Okay.
Thanks. You're welcome. I'm going to thank you so much. You were a really wonderful audience, and it was an honor to be here with you. Thank you.